Good morning. If you'll turn your Bibles to Matthew 26. Matthew 26. We will be there in just a moment in Matthew 26. During World War I, the food supply chain in the U.S. was hit hard. Most of the agricultural workers were enlisted as soldiers, and the food transportation system in the country I had to refocus on battle supplies. And as a result, in the year 1917, the U.S. National War Garden Commission was formed to encourage private landowners to grow gardens of their own in order to help with the food supply in the country and in order to ensure that our troops had enough to eat. President Woodrow Wilson said gardening was, quote, just as real and patriotic an effort as the building of ships or the firing of cannons. And he also said, quote, food will win the war. By the end of World War I, there were over 5 million gardens in the U.S. producing $1.2 billion worth of food. Even school children got involved with the establishment of the United States School Garden Army. When World War II came, these gardens became critical again. And it was George Washington Carver who coined the term victory gardens to describe them. By the end of World War II, there were 18 million victory gardens in the U.S. They literally gave life to the American people and our soldiers. They boosted morale by giving everyone in the country a sense of purpose in the war, and they also promoted unity because small communities would hold local festivals where they would have competitions to see whose crops were the best from their victory gardens. This morning I want to talk to you about a different kind of victory garden altogether, one that was far more important because it was key to our spiritual survival in the war against Satan. One which boosts our morale by giving us hope and joy and a sense of purpose, and one which promotes unity because it brings us together to rejoice in the fruit that we can all bear because of that victory. That's the victory garden of Gethsemane. This was not a garden Jesus planted. It was a garden He survived through suffering and perseverance. And because He persevered, we can have the greatest victory of all. We are in Matthew 26. Read with me just verse 36 to start. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to His disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. The word Gethsemane, and we learned this from Adam's last Bible class, means oil press. Which actually matches well with Luke's account, which says that this place was located at the foot of the Mount of Olives. So they would have gleaned and pressed olive oil from the olive trees there. But interestingly, John is the only one who calls it a garden. In fact, the phrase Garden of Gethsemane is not in Scripture anywhere. Matthew and Mark call it the place of Gethsemane. Luke just calls it the place. John doesn't say Gethsemane at all. He just says it was a garden. I think it's fascinating and faith-building to contrast what happened in this garden with what happened in the Garden of Eden. And I believe we will appreciate the Garden of Gethsemane as a victory garden even more deeply when we compare it to the failure garden of Genesis 3. So let's make those contrasts this morning. Let's first start with the conditions. In Eden, conditions were wonderful. In Gethsemane, conditions were terrible. The conditions of each of these gardens make it seem like Eden should have been the victory garden, and Gethsemane should have been the failure garden. In Eden, everything was stacked in Adam and Eve's favor. The garden was full of blessings and opportunities to flourish, whereas Gethsemane was full of pain and sorrow and suffering. Yet because of Jesus' character, in contrast to Adam and Eve's character, He was victorious under horrendously worse circumstances. Think about some of those differences. Look in verses 37 and 38. He took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and distressed. And then he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." You know, in Eden, there was no curse of sin in the world. There was no sickness, no death, no evil prevailing in the world. And yet in Gethsemane, Jesus had just spent 30 years wading through the mire of sickness, death, and evil all around him. In Eden, Adam and Eve had joy and peace. In Gethsemane, Jesus had grief and pain and distress. In Eden, God said it's not good for man to be alone. So he gave Adam a wife to be his helper. In Gethsemane, Jesus was all alone. Oh yeah, he had his disciples nearby, but he didn't have a wife and his disciples were asleep. In Eden, Adam had a pretty easy job to cultivate the garden and to keep it. In Gethsemane, Jesus had the hardest job anyone ever had before or would have thereafter, and that was to prepare himself to die on a cross for the sins of the world. In Eden, God the Father walked through the garden and had a seemingly in-person relationship with Adam and Eve. In Gethsemane, Jesus was separated from his Father's in-person presence. The stage was set for Eden to be the garden of victory and for Gethsemane to be the place of failure. But the opposite happened. For two reasons, another couple contrasts. In Eden, Adam and Eve talked to Satan. In Gethsemane, Jesus talked to God. Verses 39 and 40 through 41. He went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "You men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." In Eden, Satan had an entire conversation with Eve, and there's some debate over whether or not Adam was actually standing there listening to Satan talking to Eve, or whether Eve came later to Adam and told Adam what Satan told her. But either way, Adam ended up listening to Satan, Eve listened to Satan, and the tragic thing is neither Adam nor Eve went to God to clear things up and say, "Hey, we're getting a different story from this serpent over here. What's the deal?" No, the serpent had convinced them that God could not be trusted. And so instead of speaking to God, they didn't consult him at all. They only spoke to Satan. In Gethsemane, Jesus spends his time talking with God, not to Satan. Now, the temptation in Gethsemane is unique from that in Eden because Satan did not know Jesus' plan to die for the world's sins on a cross. So it's not like Satan came to Jesus in the garden and said, "Don't go through with the cross." You know, maybe he said that for different reasons, but not because he knew he was going to die for the sins of the world. We don't really get the impression that Satan is speaking to Jesus like he did back in the wilderness temptation period. In this case, it seems like it's more of a personal struggle within Jesus, and Jesus knows if he doesn't go through with it, Satan will win. So it's still a temptation, but just in an indirect way, to do Satan's will by giving in to his fleshly desire not to be crucified. And Jesus endures this temptation by talking to God about it. And for those of you, I say for those of you, we've all been in the throes of temptation. You know how much strength it takes to stop listening to that dialogue about weighing the pros and cons and should I do it and this would be a good benefit if I... It's so difficult to tune that out and instead fall to our knees in prayer to God in that moment of temptation. Yet that was the key to Jesus' victory in Gethsemane, and it was completely missing from Adam and Eve's failure in Eden. Also in Eden, Adam and Eve made a quick decision. In Gethsemane, Jesus wrestles for hours in prayer with his decision. Verses 42 now, down to 44. He went away again a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." And he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. You know, in Eden, it doesn't seem like Adam and Eve really deliberated very long. before they ate that forbidden fruit. They didn't say, let's sleep on it and talk about it in the morning. They didn't say, let's find out more about who this serpent is and where he came from. I mean, he says we can't trust God, but how do we know we can trust him? They didn't say, God he's really blessed us a lot. He hasn't really given us any reason to prove that he's untrustworthy, so maybe we should put the brakes on here. No, they just gave into the flesh and went for it. In Gethsemane, Jesus agonized over this decision. Back in verse 40, he asked, could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour? So the first time Jesus prays in the garden, it's for 1 hour. We think it's just for 1 second, and all he said was, if you remove this cup from me, if it's possible. But actually, he prayed for an hour. I don't think he repeated that, 1,000 times in that prayer. I think there was a lot more to it. But I'm amazed that he prays for an hour, and then he goes back a second time. And we don't know how long that second time was. And then he goes back a third time. We don't know how long that third time was. It's possible those could have been hour-long prayers as well. But Jesus made no snap decision. He wrestled with this, and he continuously and persistently sought strength from his Father to endure this temptation. His persistence in prayer was key in the victory garden of Gethsemane and completely missing from the failure garden of Eden. Let's consider some more contrasts. Turn to John 18 with me. John 18. In Eden, Adam's sin was the beginning of mankind's downfall. And in Gethsemane, Jesus' suffering was the beginning of mankind's salvation. So in John 18, he makes an interesting point that when the mob comes to arrest Jesus in the garden, Jesus saves his disciples from their hand. In verses 8 and 9, Jesus answered, I told you that I am he, John 18:8. So if you seek me, let these go their way. To fulfill the word which he spoke, of those whom you have given me, I lost not one. Often John uses double meanings in his writings, uses irony. And this act of Jesus saving his disciples from physical death at the hands of this mob, I believe, is a foreshadowing of the greater truth that he's about to save his disciples from spiritual death on the cross. In this garden, Jesus brought life. In Eden, Adam brought death. In Eden, Adam and Eve hid themselves. In Gethsemane, Jesus boldly made himself known. Same chapter, verse 4, John 18:4. So Jesus, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth, and he said to the mob, whom do you seek? And they answered him, Jesus the Nazarene. And he said to them, I am he. And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. So when he said to them, I am, they drew back and fell to the ground. Adam and Eve cowered in fear, in shame before God after their sin. Jesus, on the other hand, had absolutely nothing to hide because he was completely innocent. Most people in Jesus' situation probably would have at least tried to hide themselves from this mob for fear of being killed, but Jesus is ready to die. He comes right out to meet them head on, and the soldiers fell over in fear and in surprise at his boldness. In Eden, an angel became an enemy. In Gethsemane, an angel became a friend. When Adam and Eve sinned, they were cast out of the garden. An angel with a flaming sword was placed at its entrance to guard the way so that man would be cut off from the presence of God and from the tree of life. In Gethsemane, and only Luke mentions this, Luke says in Luke 22:43, now an angel from heaven appeared to Jesus, strengthening him. I owe a lot of these contrasts to a writer named A.W. Pink, and I want to read you some of the other contrasts that he lists between Eden and Gethsemane that we won't have time to talk about in detail. He says this, in Eden, Adam fell. In Gethsemane, the Redeemer conquered. In the one, Adam fell before Satan. In the other, the soldiers fell before Christ. In Eden, Adam took the fruit from Eve's hand. In Gethsemane, Christ received the cup from his Father's hand. In Eden, God sought Adam. In Gethsemane, the last Adam sought God. From Eden, Adam was driven. From Gethsemane, Christ was led. In Eden, the sword was drawn, referring to that angel's sword. In Gethsemane, the sword was sheathed, referring to Peter's sword. The victory gardens of the world wars were great and so critical for preserving physical life, but none compared to the victory garden of Gethsemane and how crucial that was for preserving spiritual life. Because Jesus did what Adam and Eve failed to do even under horrendously worse circumstances, we can now have victory over Satan too. Our morale can now be boosted because we now have a purpose in this war. And we can also fight as soldiers in our own victory gardens as we wrestle to do God's will the way Jesus wrestled in His garden. And we can have unity as we come together as a community of believers to rejoice in our Savior's willingness to suffer. Not just in the garden, but on the cross, He used the garden to prepare for, so that we might gain that victory. Praise be to God and to His Son for giving us the ultimate victory through the ultimate victory garden.